We shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I give the call to the member for Berowra.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Under this Prime Minister, thugs were allowed to chant anti-Semitic hate speech on the steps of the Sydney Opera House. The Prime Minister refused for months to establish an AFP task force or convene National Cabinet. And Jewish places of worship, schools, businesses and homes have been relentlessly threatened and vandalised. The Prime Minister promised Australians that social cohesion was his priority. Prime Minister, with anti-Semitism getting worse, not better, what has our country become under your government?
Give the call. Order. Members on my right. I give the call to the Honourable the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question. I've been opposed to racism in all its forms my entire life, including anti-Semitism. And indeed, on the day after the morning after the terrorist attack on October 7, I was on the Insiders condemning it unequivocally. The next morning on the Today Show, I said this in response to the demonstration that took place in Lakemba that night. Well, there's nothing to celebrate by the murder of innocent civilians going about their day. Some of those who've been captured were young people attending a rave, enjoying life, enjoying each other's company. There was word got out about the Opera House rally that was due. I spoke before the rally on 2GB. 2GB. So you as Prime Minister believe that this march should not go ahead, I was asked. I said this. I absolutely believe it should not. I went on to say that there was nothing to be achieved apart from creating a climate that is not conducive to peace. The day after those rallies, I went on to say, and in Sky News, so 2GB Sky News, so it should be familiar, went on to say, we need to lower the temperature. I don't want to see conflict here in Australia, and I don't want to see the sort of scenes I saw last night. I said one of the reasons why I believe it was just inappropriate to go ahead last night. I did a press conference in Port Lincoln in South Australia that day, 10th of October. I said there again, I think there's nothing to celebrate here. I went on to speak about the rallies and said, but the actions we saw on the weekend need to be unequivocally condemned. I did that consistently at every single opportunity, every opportunity. I've continued to do that. I note the comments of those for reasons beyond my comprehension who have argued that that was not the case. It's up to them to explain why that is not the case. Why they suggest that rather than look for the absolute maximum of unity, some have sought a different road. In this parliament, we carried a resolution as well, unequivocally, and there were some fine speeches that day. Anti-Semitism is a scourge. It's opposed by anyone who is decent. What we saw in the videos that were there yesterday are abhorrent. I note this morning I've spoken with Premier Minns. He spoke to me about the Health Minister has travelled with the Jewish Board of Deputies to Bankstown Hospital this morning to make it very clear, that the actions of these two reprehensible people in showing their hatred for people because they are Jewish, their anti-Semitism there for all to see, without any shame or without any embarrassment, is not what overwhelmingly why people go into the health profession. What I have sought and will continue to speak, and I ask my friend here to join me with it because we have been on unity tickets before, to join at every single opportunity to look for social cohesion and to look to bring people together rather than any suggestion that anything other than total condemnation of anti-Semitism is precisely what every person in my government has done, not just since October 7, but our entire political lives, as one of the reasons why people join the Labor Party, because they believe in cohesiveness in our society, because they believe in inclusion, because they believe in diversity, because they believe in respect for people regardless of their faith or their origins.
Give a call to the honourable member for Lingiari.
My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government building Australia's future to ensure no one is held back and no one is left behind? And, Prime Minister, what approaches would leave Australians worse off?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Lingiari for her question. I thank her as well for the enormous work that she does in that extraordinary electorate that is so vast, full of remote communities, an electorate, were it in Europe, that would make up at least one country and perhaps two or three, I've got to say. Now, the world has thrown a lot of challenges at us, and we know that it's been tough. We've managed the economy responsibly while providing cost-of-living relief. Tax cuts, cheaper medicines, cheaper childcare, energy bill relief, and importantly, under this Treasurer, back-to-back budget surpluses, turning a $78 billion deficit that we inherited into a $22 billion surplus. These are the strong foundations that we have laid. Inflation now, with a 2 in front of it, 2.4%, down from 6 above that we inherited. Unemployment remaining low, with 1.1 million jobs being created. And importantly, real wages increasing as well. And with our tax cuts, meaning people are earning more and getting to keep more of what they earn. Now, building Australia's future is about people. It's more than just bricks and mortar, although we're doing that too, with our plan for 1.2 million homes, with our building of Medicare urgent care clinics, with our support of fee-free TAFE. It also means fully funding all schools, not just some, and we're committed to that. It means the 3-day guarantee for childcare that those opposite tried to filibuster past today's question time. It means wiping 20% off student debt to tackle the intergenerational inequities which are there. It also means investing in our regions, making sure they have the healthcare, the services, the childcare centres, the businesses and the tourism that they need. And that's why we have been prepared to foreshadow our support for REX, whether it be through a private owner, but we won't let it just go by the wayside, something that benefits overwhelmingly electorates represented by those opposite. But we on this side of the House understand that being in government is about representing every single Australian, regardless of where they live, regardless of who is their local representative. And in spite of the opposition, to this proposal by the Liberals and National parties, we are determined to get this done and to make sure that regional Australians have that access to air transport.
Time has concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Barara.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the Greens political party is a racist, anti-Semitic party. Will the Prime Minister join with the Leader of the Opposition in committing to put the Greens last at the coming election?
Order. Order. Before I call the Prime Minister, I will hear from the Leader of the Australian Greens on a point of order.
It's a clear reflection on members and disorderly statements, and I ask that those statements be withdrawn in the question.
Order. Order. We're going to deal with this sensitively and respectfully. Order. The Minister for Industry. The Manager on a point of order.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. In response to the point of order, and I suspect that you will share this view, and that is that it was not a reflection on any individual member. It was on the Greens political party, and the Prime Minister seems willing to answer the question.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few problems with this question in terms of the Prime Minister's direct responsibilities. He can't be asked about party affairs, which is a long-standing part of practice, but he's indicated he's willing to take the question. I just asked the member for Barara to make sure his language is in line with standing orders. This is a very sensitive and hot topic, I understand that. But inflammatory language doesn't assist, I think, the chamber, but I'm not going to ask him to withdraw. But I just remind all members, because it wasn't directed to an individual. If it was, as has happened before, I would ask the member to go, but the member to withdraw. I just ask moving forward that we do use language which everyone can live with. The member for Warringah on a further point of order.
Well, just for clarification and consistency, because my understanding from the standing orders is it's a reflection on the question included a reference to a party, and completely separate to me, but that is a reflection on its members. And of course,
Order, no.
But the question is, I was required to withdraw when it was a reflection on policy, and yet here it is a reflection on a party, which is the members of a party, and that is not considered to be contrary to the standing order. So for consistency, which I'm sure everybody in this place would appreciate, I would submit respectfully that there is a discrepancy there.
The manager on a further point of order.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I think there are lots of examples in practice that support your way forward, so I would submit that that point of order is not relevant.
The Leader of the House.
Sorry for the delay. I was just trying to find the reference. It's on page 517 of practice. I think the clerk's referring the same section to you, which does explain the situations where something that is otherwise generally said may still be required to be withdrawn.
Yes. Speaker Snedden, back in time, followed a practice where a collective group of people were described in a certain way, and I won't read that into the chamber. And in the member's case, that was a slightly different variation where it was directed towards an individual. I'm not going to litigate previous decisions. Just want to remind all members, just to ensure that language is important in this place, and if I can ask members moving forward that you just reflect on that to make sure that everyone is comfortable. Now, we need to move forward, but that being said, I'm asking to assist the House for future questions that they comply within the standing orders and everyone has shown respect. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'll make 4 points. The first is you're quite right that within this chamber, leaders or indeed ministers can't be asked about their decisions to be made by political parties. And the question clearly went to that, and I refer to previous answers made by Prime Ministers, Ministers, leaders of political parties that those decisions are a matter for the political parties. That's the first point that I make, Mr Speaker. Second point that I make, I just refer to your comments about the concern about some of the language in the question. To say that, I just refer to the Director-General of ASIO's, Mike Burgess's comments about turning the heat down wherever possible. We all have a responsibility to do that. I think that it is in Australia's interests that that occur. I say that consistently. The third issue that I will say is that the reasons why there are 4 currently members of the Greens political party in the House of Representatives, all 4 of them are there in the member for Melbourne's case, directly because the Liberal Party gave preferences to Adam Bandt, which saw upon Lindsay Tanner's retirement as the member for Melbourne, saw Adam Bandt elected, and he has continued to serve since.
Order. The member for Fadden is warned.
As for the other 3, the
Order. The member for Petrie. Just got to get through this answer.
And of course, in Queensland, the Queensland LNP made a decision to put the Queensland Greens into the Queensland Parliament by giving them preferences and getting them elected. So that's the third point that I make. The fourth point that I make is that I joined at a very young age a major political party that sought to be a party of government, the Australian Labor Party, a party that I have supported since I came out of the womb, Mr Speaker, and a party that seeks to make a difference
Order.
Because, like many of us on this side of the House, we were raised in families in which being Labor and making a difference and standing up for fairness and equity was something that we were raised with from a very early age, whether it be from our parents or from the Josephite nuns, for that matter, Mr Speaker.
Order. Order. Members on my left.
The final point that I'll make, Mr Speaker.
Order. The member for Mitchell is warned. We had this debate yesterday about the time. I don't think we want to go back in time. Order. When the House comes to order, we'll hear from the member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Early Childhood Education. What action has the Albanese Labor government taken to start building a universal early education system that is simple, affordable and accessible for every family? What could put this at risk and leave families worse off?
Give the call to the Minister for Early Childhood Education, the Minister for Youth and the Minister assisting the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the wonderful member not just for her question but for the passionate way and her dedication to early childhood education and care in her electorate for Australian children right across Australia as well. Mr Speaker, it was very clear when we came into office that we inherited an early childhood education sector that was in desperate need of reform. And we've made significant progress on reforming the sector across those three pillars of affordability, accessibility and a sustainable workforce towards a vision of a universal early childhood education and care sector that is simple, that is affordable, that is accessible. Today, because of the actions of this government, there are 41,900 more educators in the sector. There are 1,083 more services, 30% of them outside major cities. And there are 97,000 more children in early childhood education and care. Because of our cheaper childcare reforms, 1 million families are better off, to the tune of around $2,700. And we're building on that by capping our fee increases as well. We have more educators in the sector and vacancy rates are down by 22%. There are more educators getting training and professional development to get into and stay in the sector that they love. And today, Mr Speaker, this House passed our 3-day guarantee. Passed our 3-day guarantee. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about risks, and it's well known that the Liberals and Nationals, those opposite, have opposed every cost of living measure that we have put before this House, every single one of them.
Order.
And today, they again—
The Minister will pause. The member for Moncrieff, that comment is unparliamentary. What you said, I'll ask you to withdraw that.
I withdraw.
I thank the member. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And today we saw the opposition again vote against the cost of living measure. Because what they voted against today was they voted against 70,000 families saving $1,370. That's what they voted against. They voted against more children, particularly children from disadvantaged families, getting access to those transformative benefits of early childhood education and care. They voted against more women being able to get back to work. They voted against low-income families accessing affordable early learning.
The member for Casey
they voted
will cease
against
rejecting.
Aspiration, and they voted against a future. because they have no plan, no vision, no policy for early childhood education and care. Instead, they want to take us back to the days of high early childhood education and care fees, back to the days of low wages for early childhood education workers. No plan for a future, only a plan for bosses to get longer lunches and a plan for $350 billion worth of cuts. Well, Australians know. Today, Australians saw just what those opposites stand for.
Give the call to the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. Just 1.6% of Australians solely use a landline, while nearly 90% have a smartphone. Will the government expand the universal service obligation to the mobile phone network in the regions? And if not, why not?
Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And I appreciate throughout this term the advocacy that she's provided for her constituents and her constructive engagement with me on a variety of communications matters across the portfolio. For the benefit of members, the USO stands for the Universal Service Obligation, and Telstra is designated as the Universal Service Provider. Basically, this is a requirement that has not changed under the current regime since it was put in place. It basically applies to landline services and, taken on a reading, a pretty basic kind of data service. The intention of the National Broadband Network, when it was conceived by Labor, was to ensure not only that we had broadband capacity across Australia, but that we had a wholesale-only access network, vertically integrated, that would provide competition into the regions. And this is where it matters. The member is very right that there is a complete lack of flexibility when it comes to the universal service obligation. That is why, in 2023, I announced that this government would undertake a full consultation into how reform could be undertaken here and how it could best benefit, in particular, those living in regional Australia. And I also pay tribute to the member for Kennedy, who has been a staunch advocate for reform in this area. We have undertaken that consultation on the scope of services, and clearly there needs to be change. This has been strongly endorsed by every stakeholder in the area, be it from the National Farmers Federation to ACAN to the industry themselves. So it is encouraging, I would say to the member for Mayo and everyone in this place, that this is an area that is long overdue for reform. And no reform happened under the previous government for a decade. But despite that, we have not only undertaken a consultation on the scope of services, but how it should be funded. And there's a variety of ways in which that could happen. Telstra, as you know, has the contract as the universal service provider under those arrangements which happened when the NBN was conceived. They are due to expire not in the immediate term but in future years, not a long way away. So we need to determine now what that is going to look like. I can say to the member that the government has been working diligently in this area. We will have more to say very soon. But I'll make three very good points. Firstly, this is an area where reform was absolutely left lacking under the previous government. Secondly, this is an area where regional Australia has missed out because of that lack of reform. And thirdly, that lack of reform flies in the face of the fact that Australians have always been early adopters. They want the best technology, they want the best connectivity. What I can assure the honourable member is that Labor will be reforming this area, and I look forward to engaging with the member as we implement those reforms.
Before I call the member for Lyons, I'd like to inform the House that present in the gallery today is a delegation of scientists and researchers who are in Parliament House today meeting with members and senators as part of the 25th year of Science Meets Parliament initiatives. On behalf of the House, welcome to question time. Call to the honourable member for Lyons.
Thank you, Speaker. My question, my last in this place, is to the Minister for Health. How is the Albanese Labor government building Australia's future and strengthening Medicare by delivering more bulk billing, more doctors and cheaper medicines? Why is urgent action needed to strengthen Medicare after a decade of cuts and neglect?
Order. Order. The Minister for Health and Aged Care has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. I thank the member for Lyons for his question, but for his friendship over 9 years. He's been a terrific representative of his electorate and a terrific advocate for a stronger Medicare in Tasmania in particular. But he was also a fierce advocate for a Medicare urgent care clinic in Bridgewater, north of Hobart, and I was delighted to visit it after it opened very late last year. It's already seen more than 1,200 patients, Mr Speaker, in only several weeks, and every single one of them has been fully bulk billed. And that is so important for Labor, because for Labor, bulk billing has always been the beating heart of Medicare. It was from its very first day, but it's also always been very hard fought. It was opposed by the AMA. Bulk billing was opposed by the Liberal Party. Famously, John Howard called bulk billing an absolute rort, and of course the Leader of the Opposition tried to abolish it altogether. Well, today, Mr Speaker, the latest data say that around 4 in 5 visits to the GP are bulk billed. Now, for me, that is too low. For Labor, that is too low. We would like to see it higher, but it must be said, Mr Speaker, not everyone in this chamber shares that view. Back when he was the Health Minister, the Leader of the Opposition did a radio interview on Radio National in August 2014.
The Minister will pause. The Manager on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Point of order is on relevance. That question referred to why is more action needed. It didn't have a request for a comparison against alternative policies. So I don't think the question invited a compare and contrast in any way that would mean that this is relevant.
It did. Order, only because the Minister was asked about the importance of strengthening Medicare after a decade of neglect. So that was in the question. Order. The member for Moreton will leave the chamber under 94A. Order. No. Order. The manager is entitled to raise his point of order, and no one will interject on him before or after, as a matter of respect. Minister in continuation.
Poor Graham. So I was saying about 4 in 5 visits are currently bulk billed, which we think is too low. We'd like to see it higher. But 2014, a decade ago when the cuts started, the Leader of the Opposition said this on Radio National. He said about 4 out of 5 services by GPs are performed for free, which is too high. Too high, he said, Mr Speaker, which explains why, of course, he then tried to impose a GP tax, and when he couldn't do that, imposed a 6-year-long freeze to the Medicare rebate. Well, we're about protecting Medicare, Mr Speaker. We're about strengthening Medicare, and at the heart of that is our effort around bulk billing. We've delivered in this term of parliament the 3 biggest increases to the Medicare rebate in 30 years. The first biggest, the second biggest and the third biggest. In 3 years, increasing the Medicare rebate by much more than they managed in 9 long years, Mr Speaker. And of course, we've tripled the bulk billing incentive. In Tasmania, that means bulk billing is up 7%, the biggest increase in the country, meaning more Tasmanians can afford to go to the doctor, and they are. GP services are up in the last 12 months by 4% in Tasmania, again the biggest increase in the country, Mr Speaker. But unlike the Leader of the Opposition, that's not good enough for us. We know there's more we need to do. But the Leader of the Opposition, of course, has different priorities. He's going to prioritise long lunches on the taxpayer's dime and $600 billion into nuclear power plants, and that's why no one trusts him with Medicare.
The Minister's time has concluded. Give the call to the Chief Opposition Whip.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Tomorrow it will be 1,000 days since the election of the Albanese Labor government. The Prime Minister promised a $275 cut on power bills and that life would be cheaper under Labor. Instead, working households are now paying up to $1,000 more for energy than promised. Their cost of living has increased by nearly 20%, and they are suffering the longest recession on record. Why won't this Prime Minister apologise to Australians for his weak leadership, bad decisions and wrong priorities?
Order. Order. Members on my right. The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for his question. Well, Mr Speaker, we're strengthening Medicare. They want to cut it. We're growing wages. They want people to work longer for less. We've cut taxes for every single taxpayer, including those in the electorate of Ford. The member for Ford voted against it.
Order.
Voted against it. We've made medicines cheaper. You've voted against it multiple times. We're building new energy now. You support a plan to build nuclear power stations in the 2040s, even though AGL have made it very clear that coal-fired power stations just can't keep going forever, and there'll be energy shortages. We're backing a future made in Australia. You want to send jobs and industries offshore. Because your plan, the member for Ford's plan,
Order.
and this bloke,
Order.
This bloke's plan,
Prime Minister can direct his remarks through the chair.
yeah, this bloke's plan here, who he supports, they have a plan that envisages 40% less energy use, 40% less energy use than what the Australian Energy Market Operator says will be necessary. That means less manufacturing, less jobs, less economic activity. We're cutting student debt by 20%. Those opposite say it's very, very bad. We're making free TAFE permanent. Those opposite say that free TAFE has no value for the 600,000 Australians who benefited from it. We've given early educators a 15% pay rise. They mock it and call it waste. We have rescued aged care from crisis. Those opposite presided over a system that was summed up in one word:
Member for
neglect.
Cowper is now
We're
warned.
delivering on the cost of living. They only care about their mate's cost of lunching. We are a government that is delivering for all Australians. We understand that cost of living pressures are real, which is why we have acted on cost of living. Those opposite have only acted on the cost of lunch for some of their people. We are a government for all Australians. We're working hard to deliver in every part of the country because only Labor does the big reforms. Only Labor. Universal Medicare, universal super, universal provision of the NDIS for those people who need it. Universal childcare, opposed once again by those opposite just before question time. Only Labor drives the big reforms. Only Labor builds to last. Only Labor is building Australia's future.
The member for Wright is warned. The call to the honourable member for Tangney.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government's responsible economy management helping in the fight against inflation and with the cost of living? And, Treasurer, what economy approaches would leave Australians worse off?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks to the member for Tangney for being an outstanding local member from the West and a great colleague, and for his important question. And, Mr Speaker, when we came to office almost 3 years ago, inflation was much higher and rising. Real wages and living standards were falling. And that's why our priority right from the beginning has been the fight against inflation and helping Australians with the cost of living. And together, Australians have made very substantial and now sustained progress when it comes to inflation. Inflation is now almost a third of what we inherited from those opposite. The headline measure is in the mid-2s and underlying is in the low 3s, and both are falling. This week, Westpac and ANZ both substantially lowered their forecasts for inflation for the first half of this year. Now, Mr Speaker, inflation is falling in Australia, but it is rising in other parts of the world. Overnight, we heard that in the US, inflation rose again, so that both their measure of underlying and headline inflation is higher there than it is here. Now, what makes the Australian experience different to what we're seeing around the world is that we've made this progress together on inflation at the same time as average unemployment has been lower under this Prime Minister than under any Prime Minister in the last 50 years. Yeah. And that means at the same time the economy, while growth is soft, has been growing, while two-thirds of the OECD have gone backwards at least once, and we've delivered back-to-back surpluses for the first time in almost 2 decades and lowered their debt by $177 billion. So inflation is down and wages are up and unemployment is low and the budget is in much better nick. Now, even as we've made this progress together as Australians, we acknowledge that growth in the economy is weak and people are under pressure, and that's why our cost of living help is so important. Getting wages moving, the tax cuts, energy bill relief, cheaper early childhood education, cheaper medicines and free TAFE. The Leader of the Opposition has opposed all of this. And he says he'll make big cuts, but he won't tell Australians what those cuts are until after the election. And the reason this will make people worse off is he can't find those $350 billion in cuts or the $600 billion he needs for nuclear reactors without going after Medicare again, without going after pension indexation or housing or veterans or disaster relief or wages. And that's why the choice at the election later this year is such a stark one for the Australian people. The Leader of the Opposition, who will make people worse off, who opposed our cost of living help and who will take Australia backwards, or this Prime Minister and his government, helping Australians with the cost of living, making progress in the fight against inflation, strengthening Medicare and building Australia's future.
Call to the honourable member for Cook.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Tomorrow will be 1,000 days since the election where the Prime Minister promised life would be cheaper under him. Instead, food is up 12%, gas 34%, rents are up 17% and Australian families have paid $50,000 more on a typical mortgage. Why won't the Prime Minister apologise to Australians for his weak leadership, bad decisions and wrong priorities?
Call to the Prime Minister. The member for Lingiari will cease objecting.
I thank the member for Cook, and I look forward to it. I wasn't aware it was 1,000 days since we were elected. I noticed when government changed hands last time, Tony Abbott didn't make it to his second anniversary because all of the cuts to health and education and the ABC all came in. And in spite of the massive majority that they were elected with, those opposite knocked off their own leader before the second anniversary, including this guy here. Now, I'm asked about cost of living. Now, the member for Cook certainly is now part of a show that opposed energy bill relief because you wanted people to be worse off, I assume. Opposed cheaper medicine because the member wanted people to pay more. Opposed higher wages because the member wanted people to earn less. And opposed tax cuts because the member wanted people to be worse off. Now, that is not our approach. And I noticed the Leader of the Opposition this week saying as well about interest rates, that the RBA governor shouldn't feel pressured one way or the other because you can cut rates and then find out they've been cut too early. Well, I'll leave that just out there. For people to read into that what they will. But we on this side of the chamber want people to be better off. We want standards of living to rise, not fall, which is why we've done the hard yards to decrease inflation, to increase wages, whilst, as the Treasurer just said, having unemployment lower on average than any government over the last 50 years. Lower than any government over 50 years. And that's at a time where, in some of our competitive nations, advanced economies, unemployment hit double digits, inflation hit double digits. There were all sorts of problems in those countries. Now, we know that people have been under pressure, but that's why we've taken action. What's extraordinary is that if the opposition had have got their way, Australians would have been, on average, $7,200 worse off. And if ever they sit on this side of the chamber, we know that Australians will be worse off, because they call relief sugar hits. Make no mistake, if they have their way, Australians will be worse off and Australians will have to pay.
Call to the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister, representing the Minister for Workplace Relations. How has the Albanese Labor government delivered higher wages for Australian workers after a decade of wages being kept deliberately low? What workplace relation policies would leave Australians worse off?
The call to the Minister representing the Minister for Workplace Relations and the Leader of the House.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Hasluck. I remember standing up during the election campaign at the Guildford Town Hall with the member for Hasluck, talking about the need to get wages moving and talking about the fact that there'd been a decade of wages flatlining. Well, 10 years of low wages as a deliberate design feature in Australia ended the day the Albanese Labor government began. Because with that one word of absolutely, there was a change from wanting to keep wages deliberately low to wanting to get wages moving in this country. You can only imagine, with global inflation, what the wage freeze of those opposite would have meant over the last 3 years if they'd been able to continue with it. Because every single thing we have put forward to get wages moving in this country, they have opposed. When we moved to fixed bargaining, they opposed it. I remember them arguing why we had to not go to these new bargaining rules. It was because it would push wages up. Well, yes, and it has. And people needed to get pay rises in this country, just like we needed to have same job, same pay, just like we needed to criminalise wage theft, to have minimum standards for gig workers. Why should there be a situation where low-paid gig workers in this country had no minimum rates at all? But those opposite fought for that to continue to be the case. They are a party that wants to continue to have people to work longer for less. Well, the results for wage rises, every one of these results is a result that those opposite tried to prevent. Pay rises for aged care workers up to 13.5%. Pay rises for early childhood educators of 15%. In 3 years, minimum wage workers now have a weekly increase over those 3 years now of an additional $143 a week, for the lowest paid in the country. 27% increase in bargaining. Flight attendants, coal miners, meat workers, all earning more, and at the same time the days lost to industrial action fallen by 63%, down. More than 1 million new jobs, more than half of them full-time. Danielle, a mine worker in the Hunter, who I've referred to before, who got her pay rise because of same job, same pay. An exact policy that those opposite have said they will take to the election to undo. Are you going to cut her pay, or are you just going to freeze her pay? Because if same job, same pay goes, it's the only reason Danielle's now paid the same as her workers, which is why she says she's now in a position to purchase a home.
Call to the honourable member for Flinders.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Tomorrow it will be 1,000 days since the election of the Albanese Labor government. The Prime Minister promised Australians he would halve migration numbers. Instead, the Prime Minister is bringing 1.8 million more people into Australia over 5 years during a housing crisis with higher rents and fewer homes being built. Why won't this Prime Minister apologise to Australians for his weak leadership, bad decisions and wrong priorities?
Order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her congratulations on our 1,000 days in office. The leader of the opposition,
member for KC,
and those opposite want to present themselves somehow as a fresh new face during their campaign over coming months, no doubt, just like his predecessor Scott Morrison did. But the truth is that he was a part of it all. 1,000 days ago, tomorrow, we did inherit a fair bit. We inherited a crisis in aged care that had been summed up with one word: neglect. We have now done what those opposite said couldn't be done, which is to put a nurse back in nursing homes 99% of the time. We're paying workers properly. Our older Australians are getting the care and dignity that they deserve. All in place. Those opposites said it couldn't happen. In Veterans Affairs, we inherited a system where literally those men and women who had defended us, our nation, our democracy—
Order.
Can't be
Members
relevant.
on my right.
Can't be relevant.
Order.
Can't be relevant.
Order. Prime Minister's just going to take a break so I can hear from the manager.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. The point of order is on relevance. The question was focused on levels of migration, nothing that the Prime Minister is referring to, and the Prime Minister needs to explain why his record migration program in a housing crisis is justified.
Okay. If it was just on that topic, you would be correct. But when you phrase a question about the Prime Minister's leadership, about the priorities and asking for an apology, the Prime Minister is obviously going to take an argument as he sees fit with that part of the question. So he's directly relevant and he'll continue.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. He's new, Mr Speaker. He's new to the job. In Veterans Affairs, there were 60,000 people waiting for payments that they had earned due to their service for our country. People died waiting to get entitlements that they deserved. That's before we get through to the human impact of the robo-debt scheme. 1,000 days ago, we inherited a crisis in skills, the worst skills shortage in 50 years. We inherited inflation that was rising. We inherited wages that were falling. We inherited a crisis in health with Medicare bulk billing in freefall. We inherited a crisis in the NDIS, rorting and rip-offs, packages being cut. We inherited a fiscal crisis, $1 trillion in debt and deficits, including $78 billion being forecast in that first year, and a crisis in accountability as well. We inherited after a Prime Minister who had sworn himself into multiple portfolios, in some cases without any knowledge, including the bloke he shared a house with at the Lodge. The Treasurer didn't know that there was another Treasurer. It was just extraordinary. That was the chaos that we inherited from those opposite. No
Order.
cabinet processes, just overheads. Overheads in the cabinet room. We inherited a crisis in energy, of course, an ageing grid, 4 gigs out, 1 gig in. And we inherited a crisis as well in our immigration system presided over by those opposite, a crisis exposed by 3 separate reports.
The call to the honourable member for Parramatta.
My question is to the Minister for Education. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to build a better and fairer education system, and what approaches to education would leave Australian students worse off?
The call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend, the brilliant member for Parramatta, for his question. Mr Speaker, just over an hour ago we passed laws through this place that will help more kids get a great start in life, that will help more kids get ready to start school, that will guarantee their mums and dads get access to 3 days a week of government-supported early education and care. And if you ever need an example of the difference between us and them, between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, then this is it, because they voted against it. They voted against legislation to help some of the most disadvantaged kids in this country get the early education that they need to start school ready to learn. It's a real-life example of opening the doors of opportunity for our kids, and they voted to slam it shut. And here's the kicker. The argument that they use is that we can't afford it. But apparently we can afford billions of dollars for bosses to have lunch on the taxpayer. There's the difference. A 3-day guarantee for our kids under Labor, or a 3-course guarantee for bosses under the Liberal Party. And this is not the only place where the difference is clear. We're fixing the funding of our schools, and we're tying that funding to the sort of things that will help children who fall behind at school to catch up, through things like free tutoring. If they win, that all goes. Free tutoring replaced by free lunches, again, leaving our kids worse off. And if we win the election, we'll also do something else. We will cut student debts of 3 million Australians by 20%. If they win, that won't happen either, because they're opposed to that too. And, Mr Speaker, here's the press release from the Shadow Treasurer on the 3rd of November, on the day that they said they were opposed to cutting student debt by 20%. And I promise you I'm not making this up. Their argument for opposing it is this, quote, "There are no free lunches in economics." Well, turns out there is, but only for the bosses. A bit of Vichy soir on the taxpayer Visa card, a bit of taxpayer-funded turducken. You don't know what that is? That's a chicken stuffed in a duck, stuffed in a turkey, which is a perfect analogy for this policy, because I think most Australians will think it's stuffed.
Order. Order. When the House comes to order, we'll hear from the honourable member for Calais.
To the Treasurer. Petrol prices in Mudgee have been disgracefully high for way too long. They're consistently 30 to 40 cents per litre higher than other parts of our region, sometimes even higher than that. The ACCC is not acting. Will you and your government take action to stop this outrageous price gouging that's being perpetrated by fuel companies in a cost-of-living crisis?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for his question. I'm happy to take that up with the ACCC. The ACCC does have an important role when it comes to monitoring petrol prices. We do know from time to time there is a risk that petrol stations, particularly in the regions, there is a risk that they can do the wrong thing. And where they are doing the wrong thing, we should be reporting them to the ACCC to make sure that it isn't happening.
Before I call the honourable member for Reid, I'm pleased to welcome in the House John Gosling AM from Guide Dogs Victoria, the dad of the member for Solomon. Give the call to the honourable member for Reid.
My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How is the Albanese Labor government's energy plan helping Australian families and small businesses with their energy bills? What proposals for the energy system would leave Australians worse off?
Call to the Honourable Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the question, and I'm pleased to tell the member for Reid and the House about new figures out today, which show that last year was a record year for new renewable energy investment. $9 billion invested over the course of last year, Mr Speaker, creating 10,000 construction jobs across the country, building the energy system of the future, introducing more, cheaper, reliable, renewable energy into our grid. After a decade in which 4 gigawatts of dispatchable energy left the grid and only 1 gigawatt came on, last year we saw this record, which benefits families and small businesses. Now, Mr Speaker, the honourable member asked me what energy policies might hurt Australians. And, of course, the good thing about that $9 billion worth of expenditure last year is that the vast bulk of it came from the private sector, came from private investors into our energy system. Now, a policy which would take Australia backwards would be a policy which is taxpayer-funded to the tune of $600 billion, and that's the policy of the opposition. The nuclear policy is a thirsty one, Mr Speaker. It's thirsty for money and thirsty for water. That's the indication we have from the opposition. As the Minister for Water and I pointed out today, they would need a Sydney harbour every year for their nuclear policy. The member for Fairfax has been flogging the Harbour Bridge all year. Now he needs to throw in the entire Sydney Harbour because it's a policy which would take water away from farmers across the country, but it would also require money. It would be paid for by taxpayers. Now, to be fair to the Leader of the Opposition, he's been out talking about his policy. He was out last week. He subjected himself to an interview with that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Peter Credlin, and he was asked during that interview about his nuclear policy, And I've got to say, Mr Speaker, this interview is being compared to the Frost-Nixon interviews for its searching intellect, for the tough questions. Ray Hadley wasn't available on the evening. But this interview, Mr Speaker, saw the Leader of the Opposition talk about his nuclear policy. I'm going to defend the Leader of the Opposition because I thought it was a good choice. They could talk about old times, like the 2014 budget, Mr Speaker, where they took $50 billion out of the health system. As my friend the Minister for Health has pointed out at the dispatch box once or twice, the Leader of the Opposition was voted Australia's worst health minister because of the $50 billion he cut. But now he'd need to cut $600 billion to pay for his nuclear policy, plus $10 billion a year to pay for the free lunch policy, plus the $350 billion of cuts that they admit to, Mr Speaker. So the 2014 budget would look like a Sunday picnic, because we know the Leader of the Opposition has said there'll be cuts, but he'll tell us about them after the election. So we have this policy which will cost $600 billion, and you know what will follow? A horror budget, cigars and all, cuts to health, cuts to education to pay for his nuclear fantasy.
The call to the member for Bass.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Tomorrow it will be 1,000 days since the election of the Albanese Labor government. The Prime Minister promised Australians that he would deliver 1.2 million new homes. Instead, mortgages are up, approvals are down, construction costs are skyrocketing, rents are through the roof, and the Australian dream of home ownership has never been further out of reach. Why won't this Prime Minister apologise for his weak leadership, bad decisions and wrong priorities?
Call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Bass for her question. It has indeed been 1,000 days, and 84% of taxpayers are better off because of our tax cuts. 84%. 1,000 days and $1 billion have been saved thanks to cheaper medicines. 1,000 days and 1.1 million free doctor's appointments at urgent care clinics, including the one in your electorate. 1,000 days and 5.8 million extra bulk billed appointments thanks to our bulk billing increases. 1,000 days in the upgrade of Launceston Hospital, delivered by this side. 1,000 days and 2.6 million award wage workers with better pay. 1,000 days and over 1 million families have an average of $2,700 cheaper childcare as a result of our reforms. 1,000 days and 600,000 Australians getting access to free TAFE. 1,000 days and thousands of workers earning more because of same job, same pay, including Nicole, who I met in Queensland, earning more than $30,000 additional just by being paid the same wage as the person they're working beside, doing the same job with the same experience. 1,000 days and we've delivered 1.1 million new jobs. Now, the member for Bass is part of an operation that have delivered three policies. One, the $10 billion to fund long lunches for businesses. I say to Australians, they'll keep asking you to dig deep so someone else can dig in. Simple as that. Two, $600 billion to build nuclear reactors. Now, there won't be any of them in Tasmania, but Tasmanian taxpayers will pay.
The Prime Minister will pause. The member for Bass on a point of order.
Relevant, Speaker. There's not much left of the answer, and the Prime Minister hasn't mentioned housing, which was what I asked about.
Order. The Prime Minister's got 48 seconds. Just make sure his answer is being directly relevant to the fairly broad question, but it was about housing as well.
Thanks, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I'll tell you what will happen with housing with the third policy. So we have the free lunches, we have the $600 billion nuclear reactors, but we've got a third policy as well from those opposite, cuts to everything to pay for it, including cutting the Housing Australia Future Fund. Less money for public and social housing. I've opened new social housing in the members' electorate there in Launceston, along with a community housing provider that the member might have voted for, but all of her colleagues didn't. So I suggest to the member that she knows the answer herself, because she voted for things that the Liberal Party voted against, because she's a good person, but she's in a very bad party.
Give the call to the honourable member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. How is the Albanese Labor government working to protect access to air services in regional Australia? Are there other approaches that will leave regional Australians worse off?
Call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Gilmore for the question? I know she is a fantastic supporter of regional aviation and a great supporter of the announcement we made just this week about investments in her electorate at the Moruya Airport that she has advocated for. Of course, the Albanese Labor government is building Australia's future by working to ensure the future of critical aviation services in our regions. We believe that Australians living in regional and remote communities deserve access to air travel that is affordable and is reliable. Yesterday, we announced that the government will support shortlisted bidders to maximise a successful sale of Rex Airlines to ensure crucial regional aviation services continue beyond 30 June. We've been clear that the Commonwealth is not a bidder in this process, but we do want to see a successful market-led outcome. When markets fail or struggle to deliver for regional communities, the government does have a role. It has a role to ensure people don't miss out on opportunities, education and the critical connections that aviation brings. The same is, of course, true in telecommunications as well. And we have been clear, absolutely clear, that if there is no second sale, we will look at the contingency options, including preparations necessary for potential Commonwealth acquisitions, and will work with the states on that. While this side of the House is doing everything we can to protect and support regional Australians, we saw the Liberals and Nationals confirm that they see no role for government in this, and in fact they have actively said that they will oppose it. We saw what we saw. What we saw, of course, was we had the shadow finance minister saying Commonwealth acquisition was a bridge too far,
and of course, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition just needs to not interject for the remainder of this answer, and it will be greatly appreciated by me and the House. Minister has the call.
Thank you very much. And I'll get to the comments by the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition says that governments shouldn't own airlines. Governments shouldn't own airlines. This is about the Australian government saying, look, this is really important to regional Australia that we actually say this. But she does think that it is perfectly okay for governments to own $600 billion worth of publicly owned nuclear reactors. That's what the Deputy Leader of the Opposition thinks is worthy, absolutely important for the Commonwealth to own. Now, what an absolute joke. You either back regional Australia, you back making sure we continue to have services in our regional communities, or you back $600 billion of publicly owned nuclear reactors and the cuts that are coming in order to actually fund them. What we've seen on that side of the House have got no interest in supporting regional Australia, no interest in supporting making sure we continue to have that connectivity. Unlike the Liberals and Nationals, we're going to back regional airlines.
Call to the honourable member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Housing Minister. Minister, in 2023, National Cabinet agreed on 9 reforms under the Better Deal for Renters. However, both National Shelter and the Tenants' Union note that in Tasmania the state government is currently not pursuing 6 of the 9 agreed reforms. So, Minister, why is the Tasmanian government being allowed to slow-walk these agreed reforms, and will the federal government finally inject some urgency into nationally consistent protections for renters?
Give the call to the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Homelessness.
Thanks, Speaker, and I really want to thank the member for Clark for his question about subjects that we have a really shared passion for, and that is the situation faced by renters across our country right now. I know that the member will be meeting with his constituents, as I do, not necessarily young renters, but renters who are middle-aged, who've got children of their own, and who are living in that precarious situation where they're getting moved from property to property and sometimes having to move their kids from school to school. So this is something that I don't want to see, and people sometimes ask me in this job what gets me out of bed in the morning. One of them is this. If we go back to around the year I was born, 60% of young low-income people across our country own their own home. Today that number's 20%. So this tells us that we've got not only a long-term issue with housing in our country, but that just because of housing, the experience of low-income people across Australia is very different to how it was 40 years ago. So, Speaker, the implicit in the member's question, I think, is an acknowledgement that these really important issues of the rights of renters sit at the state level. Almost all previous governments have basically said we want nothing to do with this problem, but that's not been the case with our government. The Prime Minister, of course, has placed housing at the very heart of our government's agenda, and so instead of ignoring this problem, has sat down with the states, has made an agreement, the National Housing Accord, and part of that agreement is asking all the states to sign up to these really important new rental standards. So it's things like ending no-fault evictions, banning rent bidding, limiting excessive rent increases and ensuring minimum standards for rental accommodation. So the member asked about the performance of the Tasmanian government. Each of the states reports into me in their progress, and the last report I received was December 2024. Tasmania reported that they are complete on 7 of 9 of their requirements and 2 of 9 are in progress. So I see you shaking your head there. The national shelter numbers are from a few months earlier, and I think that probably explains the discrepancy. But if the member doesn't mind, I'd really appreciate the opportunity to sit down with him and go through the report, and I'm very happy to work with him to push the Tasmanian government to move faster. I can tell you, no one wants the states to move faster on this than me. It's part of a really important part of the government's urgent housing agenda, and I thank him for his question.
Call to the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What has the Albanese Labor government done to help ease cost of living pressures Australians are facing? Are there any approaches which would make Australians worse off?
Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for Bennelong for his question. It was terrific to be with him in Eastwood last Saturday at the Lunar New Year celebrations. We have an economy that is growing. We have inflation which is down to a 4-year low. We have wages that are up, pay packets growing at the fastest pace since 2012. Unemployment on average is the lowest it has been under any government in 50 years in the context of a global economic crisis. 1.1 million jobs created, more than 2/3 of them have been full-time. We have the smallest gender pay gap on record. Fewer days lost to industrial disputes, a record number of small businesses and record business investment.
The member for Fisher.
We've delivered tax cuts for every single taxpayer. Cost of living support rollout, energy bill relief, cheaper childcare, cheaper medicines, extra GP appointments, free TAFE, the largest increase in rent assistance of 45% over 2 increases in 30 years. Student debt relief for 3 million Australians with more to come. The first back-to-back surpluses in 2 decades. Less debt to the tune of $200 billion saved as a result of the hard work that we have done. And I'm asked about alternatives. Well, the Leader of the Opposition was a senior minister for every day of the former government. Every day. Every Australian will remember all too well what he means when he speaks about going back. Back to rising inflation, back to wages being kept deliberately low, back to aged care in crisis, bulk billing in free fall, childcare being out of reach, back to chasing manufacturing offshore, back to Australia being completely isolated on the world stage, back to secret ministries and robo-debt, back to wasting hundreds of millions of dollars on commuter car parks that weren't anywhere near train stations.
at the beginning of the show, he was appointed Health Minister. He was so bad that he was dumped by Tony Abbott, but you know what was worse? He was replaced by Susan Ley. And on that note, Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.